Good morning, boys and girls. All right, we're going to keep reading Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. And I actually had to look at this chapter again because I realized that I said one of the words wrong in the title of the chapter. So this chapter, chapter 5, is called I Play Pinochle with a Horse. So our last chapter, we were introduced to Percy and Grover, and Percy's mom were at the beach, and a big storm came through, and they got back in the Camaro and they crashed it, and they were on their way to the summer camp that Percy's mom kind of was nervous about sending him to, and he ended up fighting this big mythological creature. Remember, they said it was like half bull, half man. So that is where we left off. Remember, his mom disappeared, and he barely made it to the hill. Okay, so chapter 5 is called I Play Pinochle with a Horse. All right. I had weird dreams full of barnyard animals. Most of them wanted to kill me. The rest wanted food. I must have woken up several times, but what I heard and saw made no sense, so I just passed out again. I remember lying in a soft bed, being spoon-fed something that tasted like buttered popcorn, only it was pudding. The girl with curly blonde hair hovered over me, smirking as she scraped drips off my chin with the spoon. When she saw my eyes open, she asked, "What will happen at the summer solstice?" I managed to croak, "What?" She looked around as if afraid someone would overhear. "What's going on? What was stolen? We've only got a few weeks." "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "I don't." Somebody knocked on the door, and the girl quickly filled my mouth with pudding. The next time I woke up, the girl was gone. A husky blonde dude, like a surfer, stood in the corner of the bedroom, keeping watch over me. He had blue eyes, at least a dozen of them, on his cheeks, his forehead, and the back of his hands. When I finally came around for good, there was nothing weird about my surroundings, except that they were nicer than I was used to. I was sitting in a deck chair on a huge porch, gazing across a meadow at green hills in the distance. The breeze smelled like strawberries. There was a blanket over my legs, a pillow behind my neck. All that was great, but my mouth felt like a scorpion had been using it for a nest. My tongue was dry and nasty, and every one of my teeth hurt. On the table next to me was a tall drink. It looked like iced apple juice with a green straw and a paper parasol stuck through a maraschino cherry. My hand was so weak I almost dropped the glass once I got my fingers around it. "Careful," a familiar voice said. Grover was leaning against the porch railing, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Under one arm, he cradled a shoebox. He was wearing blue jeans, Converse high tops, and a bright orange t-shirt that said Camp Half-Blood. Just plain old Grover, not the goat boy. Maybe I'd had a nightmare. Maybe my mom was okay. We were still on vacation, and we'd stop here at this big house for some reason, and... "You saved my life," Grover said. Well, the least I could do. I went back to the hill, and I thought you might want this." Reverently, he placed the shoebox in my lap. Inside was a black and white bull's horn. The base jagged from being broken off, the tip splattered with dried blood. It hadn't been a nightmare. "The Minotaur," I said. Percy, that isn't a good idea." "That's what they call them in the Greek myths, isn't it?" I demanded. "The Minotaur, half man, half bull." Grover shifted uncomfortably. "You've been out for 2 days. How much do you remember?" "My mom. Is she really?" He looked down. I started across the meadow. There were groves of trees and a widening stream, acres of strawberries spread out under the blue sky. The valley was surrounded by rolling hills, and the tallest one, directly in front of us, was the one with the huge pine tree on top. Even that looked beautiful in the sunlight. My mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look beautiful. "I'm sorry," Grover sniffled. "I'm a failure. I'm the worst satyr in the world." He moaned, stomped his foot so hard it came off. The Converse high top came off. Inside was filled with styrofoam, except for a hoof-shaped hole. "Oh, sticks," he mumbled. Thunder rolled across the sky. As he struggled to get his hoof back in the fake foot, I thought, well, that settles it. Grover was a satyr. I was ready to bet that if I shaved his curly brown hair, I'd find tiny horns on his head, but I was too miserable to care that satyrs existed, or even minotaurs. All that meant was my mom really had been squeezed into nothingness, dissolved into yellow light. I was alone, an orphan. I would have to live with Smelly Gabe. No, that would never happen. I would live on the streets first. I would pretend I was 17 and join the army. I'd do something. Grover was still sniffling. The poor kid, poor goat, satyr, whatever, looked as if he expected to be hit. Grover was still sniffling. The poor kid, sorry. I said, "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was. Was supposed to protect you." "Didn't my mother ask you to protect me?" "No, but that's my job. I'm a keeper. At least, I was." "But why?" I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision swimming. "Don't strain yourself," Grover said. "Here." He helped me hold the glass and put the straw to my lips. I recoiled at the taste because I was expecting apple juice. It wasn't that at all. It was chocolate chip cookies, liquid cookies, and not just any cookies, my mom's homemade blue chocolate chip cookies, buttery and hot, with the chips still melting. Drinking it, my whole body felt warm and good, full of energy. My grief didn't go away, but I felt as if my mom had just brushed her hand against my cheek, given me a cookie the way she used to when I was small, and told me everything was going to be okay. Before I knew it, I drained the glass. I stared into it. Sure, I had just had a warm drink, but the ice cubes hadn't even melted. "Was it good?" Grover asked. I nodded. "What did it taste like?" He sounded so wistful. I felt guilty. "Sorry, I should have let you taste." His eyes got wide. "No, that's not what I meant. I just wondered." "Chocolate chip cookies," I said. "My mom's, homemade." He sighed. "And how do you feel?" "Like I could throw Nancy Bobofit 100 yards. "That's good," he said. "That's good. I don't think you could risk drinking any more of that stuff." "What do you mean?" He took the empty glass from me gingerly, as if it were dynamite, and set it back on the table. "Come on. Kieran and Mr. D are waiting." The porch wrapped all the way around the farmhouse. My legs felt wobbly, trying to walk that far. Grover offered to carry the Minotaur horn, but I held on to it. I paid for that souvenir the hard way. I wasn't going to let it go. As if we came around the opposite end of the house, I caught my breath. We must have been on the north shore of Long Island, because on this side of the house, the valley marched all the way up to the water, which glittered about a mile in the distance. Between here and there, I simply couldn't process everything I was seeing. The landscape, dotted with buildings that looked like ancient Greek architecture, an open-air pavilion, an amphitheater, a circular arena, except that they all looked brand new, their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. In a nearby sandpit, a dozen high school-aged kids and satyrs played volleyball. Canoes glided across a small lake. Kids in bright orange t-shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled into the woods. Some shot targets at an archery range. Other rode horses down the wooded trail. And unless I was hallucinating, some of their horses had wings. Down at the end of the porch, two men sat across from each other at the card table. A blonde-haired girl who spoon-fed me popcorn-flavored pudding was leaning on the porch rail next to them. The man facing me was small but porky. He had a red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair so black it was almost purple. He looked like those paintings of baby angels. What do you call them? Hubbubs? No. Cherubs. That's it. He looked like a cherub who'd turned middle-aged in a trailer park. He wore a tiger pattern Hawaiian shirt, and he would have fit right in at one of Gabe's poker parties. Except I got the feeling this guy could have outgambled even my stepfather. "That's Mr. D," Grover murmured to me. "He's the camp director. Be polite. That girl, that's Annabeth Chase. She's just a camper, but she's been here longer than about anybody. And you already know Kieran." He pointed at the guy whose back was to me. First, I realized he was sitting in the wheelchair. Then I recognized the tweed jacket, the thinning brown hair, the scraggly beard. "Mr. Bruner!" I cried. The Latin teacher turned and smiled at me. His eyes had that mischievous glint that they sometimes got in class when he pulled a pop quiz and made all the multiple choice answers B. "Ah, good, Percy," he said. "Now we have four for pinochle." He offered me a chair to the right of Mr. D, who looked at me with bloodshot eyes and heaved a great sigh. Oh, I suppose I must say it. Welcome to Camp Half-Blood. There. Now don't expect me to be glad to see you. Thanks. I scooted a little farther away from him because if there was one thing I had learned about living with Gabe, it was how to tell when an adult has been hitting the happy juice. If Mr. D was a stranger to alcohol, I was a satyr. Annabeth? Mr. Bruner called to the blonde girl. She came forward and Mr. Bruner introduced us. This young lady nursed you back to health, Percy. Annabeth, my dear, why don't you go check on Mr. Percy's bunk? We'll be putting him in cabin 11 for now. Annabeth said, Sure, Kieran. She was probably half my age, maybe a couple inches taller, and a whole lot more athletic looking. With her deep tan and her curly blonde hair, she was almost exactly what I thought the stereotypical California girl would look like, except her eyes ruined the image. They were startling gray, like storm clouds. Pretty, but intimidating too, as if she were analyzing the best way to take me down in a fight. She glanced at the minotaur horns in my hand, then back at me. I imagined she was going to say, You killed a minotaur, or Wow, you're so awesome, or something like that. Instead, she said, You drool when you sleep. Then she sprinted off down the lawn, her blonde hair flying behind her. So, I said, anxious to change the subject, you, work here, Mr. Bruner? Not Mr. Bruner. The ex-Mr. Bruner said, I'm afraid that was a pseudonym. You may call me Kieran. Okay, totally confused. I looked at the director. Mr. D, does that stand for something? Mr. D stopped shuffling cards. He looked at me just like I had belched loudly. Young man, names are powerful things. You don't just go around using them for no reason. Oh, right. Sorry. I must say, Percy, Kieran Bruner broke in, I'm glad to see you alive. It's been a long time since I've made a house call to a potential camper. I'd hate to think I'd wasted my time. House call? My year at Yancey Academy, to instruct you. We have satyrs at most schools, of course, keeping a lookout. But Grover alerted me as soon as he met you. He sensed you were something special, so I decided to come upstate. I convinced another Latin teacher to, take a leave of absence. I tried to remember the beginning of the school year. It seemed like so long ago, but I did have a fuzzy memory of there being another Latin teacher my first week at Yancey. Then, without explanation, he had disappeared, and Mr. Bruner had taken the class. You came to Yancey just to teach me, I asked. Kieran nodded. Honestly, I wasn't sure about you at first. We contacted your mother, let her know that we were keeping an eye on you in case you were ready for Camp Half-Blood, but you still had so much to learn. Nevertheless, you made it here alive, and that's always the first test. Grover, Mr. D said impatiently, are you playing or not? Yes, sir. Grover trembled as he took the fourth chair. I didn't know why he should be so afraid of a pudgy little man in a tiger print Hawaiian shirt. You do know how to play pinochle. Mr. D eyed me suspiciously. I'm afraid not, I said. I'm afraid not, sir, he said. Sir, I repeated. I was liking the camp director less and less. Well, he told me, it is along with gladiator fighting and Pac-Man, one of the greatest games ever invented by humans. I would expect all civilized young men to know the rules. I'm sure the boy can learn, Kieran said. Please, I said. What is this place? What am I doing here? Kieran, why would you go to Yancey Academy just to teach me? Mr. T snorted. I asked the same question. The camp director dealt the cards. Grover flinched every time one landed in his pile. Kieran smiled at me sympathetically, the way he used to in Latin class, as if to let me know that no matter what my average was, I was his star student. He expected me to have the right answer. Percy, he said, did your mother tell you nothing? She said, I remembered her sad eyes looking out there over the sea. She told me she was afraid to send me here, even though my father had wanted her to. She said that once I was here, I probably couldn't leave, so she wanted to keep me close to her. Typical, Mr. D said. That's how they usually get killed. Young man, are you bidding or not? What? I asked. He explained impatiently how you bid in pinochle, and so I did. I'm afraid there's too much to tell, Kieran said. I'm afraid our usual orientation film won't be sufficient. Orientation film? I asked. No, Kieran decided. Well, Percy, you know your friend Grover is a satyr. You know, he pointed to the horn in the shoebox, that you have killed a minotaur. No small feat either, lad. What you may not know is that great powers are at work in your life. Gods, the forces you call the Greek gods, are very much alive. I stared at the others around the table. I waited for somebody to yell, "Not," but all I got was Mr. D yelling, "Oh, a royal marriage. Trick, trick," he cackled as he tallied up his points. "Mr. D," Grover asked him timidly, "if you're not going to eat it, can I have your Diet Coke can?" All right. Grover bit a huge shard out of the empty aluminum can and chewed it mournfully. "Wait," I told Kieran. "You're telling me that there's such thing as a god?" "Well, now," Kieran said, "God, capital G, God, that's a different matter altogether. We shan't deal with the metaphysical." "Metaphysical? But you were just talking about, gods, plural, as in the great beings that control the forces of nature in human endeavors, and the immortal gods of Olympus. That's a smaller matter." "Smaller?" "Yes, quite. The gods were discussed in Latin class. Zeus, I said, Hera, Apollo, you mean them?" And there it was again, the distant thunder on a cloudless day. "Young man," said Mr. D, "I would really be less casual about throwing those names around if I were you." "But they're stories," I said. "They're myths. So explain to the lightning and the seasons and the stuff. They're what people believed before there was science." "Science?" Mr. D scoffed. "And tell me, Perseus Jackson." I flinched when he said my real name, which I never told anybody. "What would people think of your science 2,000 years from now?" Mr. D continued. Will they just call it primitive mumbo jumbo? That's what. Oh, I love mortals. They have absolutely no sense of perspective. They think they've come so far. And have they, Kieran? Look at this boy and tell me." I wasn't liking Mr. D much, but there was something about the way he called me mortal, as if he wasn't. It was enough to put a lump in my throat, to suggest why Grover was dutifully minding his cards, chewing his soda can, and keeping his mouth shut. "Percy," Kieran said, "you may choose to believe or not, but the fact is, immortal means immortal. Can you imagine, for a moment, never dying?" Sorry, I lost my place. "Never fading, existing, just as you are, for all time?" I was about to answer, off the top of my head. That is, it sounded like a pretty good deal, but the tone of Kieran's voice made me hesitate. "You mean, whether people believed in you or not?" I said. "Exactly," Kieran agreed. "If you were a god, how would you like being called a myth, an old story to explain lightning? What if I told you, Perseus Jackson, that someday people would call you a myth? They just created to explain how little boys can get over losing their mothers." My heart pounded. He was trying to make me angry for some reason, but I wasn't going to let him. I said, "I wouldn't like it, but I don't believe in gods." "Oh, you'd better," Mr. D murmured, "before one of them incinerates you." Grover said, "Please, sir, he's just lost his mother. He's in shock. A lucky thing, too," Mr. D grumbled, playing a card. "Bad enough, even though I'm confined to this miserable job, working with boys who don't even believe." He waved his hand and a goblet appeared on the table, as if the sunlight had bent, momentarily, and woven in the air into the glass. The goblet filled itself with red wine. My jaw dropped, but Kieran hardly looked up. "Mr. D," he warned, "your restrictions." Mr. D looked at the wine and feigned surprise. "Dear me," he looked at the sky and yelled, "Old habits. Sorry." More thunder. Mr. D waved his hand again. More thunder. Mr. D waved his hand again, and the wineglass changed into a fresh can of Diet Coke. He sighed unhappily, popped the top of the soda, and went back to his card game. Kieran winked at me. "Mr. D offended his father a while back, took a fancy to a wood nymph who had been declared off limits." "A wood nymph?" I repeated, still staring at the Diet Coke can like it was from outer space. "Yes," Mr. D confessed. "Father loves to punish me. First time, prohibition. Ghastly. Absolutely horrid. 10 years. The second time, well, she was really pretty, and I couldn't stay away. The second time, he sent me here, Half-Blood Hill, summer camp for brats like you. Be a better influence, he told me. Work with youths rather than tearing them down. Ha! Absolutely unfair. Mr. D sounded about 6 years old, pouting like a little kid. And I stammered, "Your father is D. Immortalis." "Kieran," Mr. D said, "I thought you taught the boy the basics. My father is Zeus, of course." I ran D through the names from the Greek mythology: wine, the skin of a tiger, the satyrs that all seemed to work here. The way Grover cringed, as if Mr. D were his master. "You're Dionysus," I said, "the god of wine." Mr. D rolled his eyes. "What do they say these days, Grover? What do the children say?" "Well, duh." Yes, Mr. D. "Well, then, duh. Percy Jackson, did you think I was Aphrodite, perhaps?" "You're a god?" "Yes, child, a god. You." He turned to look at me straight on, and I saw a kind of purplish fire in his eyes, a hint that this wimpy, plump little man was only showing me the tiniest bit of his true nature. I saw visions of grapevines choking unbelievers to death, drunken warriors insane with battle lust, sailors screaming as their hands turned to flippers, their false elongating, their faces elongating into dolphin snouts. I knew that if I pushed him, Mr. D would show me worse things. He would plant a disease in my brain that would leave me wearing a straitjacket in a rubber room for the rest of my life. "Would you like to test me, child?" he said quietly. "No, no, sir." The fire died a little. He turned back to his card game. "I believe I win." "Not quite, Mr. D," Kieran said. He set down a straight, tallied the points, and said, "The game goes to me." I thought Mr. D was going to vaporize Kieran right out of his wheelchair, but he just sighed through his nose, as if he were used to being beaten by the Latin teacher. He got up, and Grover rose too. "I'm tired," Mr. D said. "I believe I'll take a nap before the sing-along tonight. But first, Grover, we need to talk, again, about your less than perfect performance on this assignment." Grover's face beaded with sweat. Yes, sir." Mr. D turned to me. "Cabin 11, Percy Jackson, and mind your manners." He swept into the farmhouse, Grover following miserably. "Will Grover be okay?" I asked Kieran. Kieran nodded, though he looked a little bit troubled. "Old Dionysus isn't really mad. He just hates his job. He's been, grounded, I guess you would say, and he can't stand waiting another century before he's allowed to go back to Olympus." "Mount Olympus," I said. "You're telling me there really is a place there?" "Well, now there's Mount Olympus in Greece, and then there's the home of the gods, the convergence point of their powers, which did indeed used to be on Mount Olympus. It's still called Mount Olympus out of respect to the old ways, but the place moves, Percy, just as the gods do." "You mean the Greek gods are here? Like in America?" "Well, certainly. The gods move with the heart of the West." "The what?" "Come now, Percy. What you call Western civilization. Do you think that's just an abstract concept? No, it's a living force, a collective consciousness that has burned bright for thousands of years. The gods are part of it. You might even say that they are the source of it. Or at least they are tied so tightly to it that they couldn't possibly fade. Not unless all of Western civilization were obliterated. The fire started in Greece. Then, as you well know, or as I hope you know since you passed my course, the heart of the fire moved to Rome. So did the gods. Oh, the different names, perhaps. Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, and so on. But the same forces and the same gods. And then they died? Died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved to Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was the brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to go, all you need to do is look at the architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 3,000 years, you can see them in paintings and statues, on the most important buildings. And yes, Percy, of course, they are now in your United States. Look at your symbol, the eagle of Zeus. Look at the statue of Prometheus in Rockefeller Center, the Greek facades of your government buildings in Washington. I defy you to find any American city where the Olympians are not prominently displayed in multiple places. Like it or not, and believe me, plenty of people weren't very fond of Rome either. America is now the heart of the flame. It is the great power of the West, and so Olympus is here, and we are here. It was all too much, especially the fact that I seemed to be included in Kieran's we, as if I were part of some club. Who are you, Kieran? Who am I? Kieran smiled. He shifted his weight as if he were going to get up out of his wheelchair, but I knew that was impossible. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Who are you? He mused. Well, that's the question we all want answered, isn't it? But for now, we should get you to a bunk in cabin 11. There will be new friends to meet, and plenty of time for lessons tomorrow. Besides, there will be s'mores by the campfire tonight, and I simply adore chocolate. And then he did rise from his wheelchair. But there was something odd about the way he did it. His blanket fell away from his legs, but the legs didn't move. His waist kept getting longer, rising above his belt. At first, I thought he was wearing a very long white velvet underwear, but as he kept rising out of the chair, taller than any man, I realized that the velvet underwear wasn't underwear. It was the front of an animal and muscle, and front of animal muscle and sinew under a coarse white fur. The wheelchair wasn't a chair. It was some kind of container, an enormous box on wheels, and it must have been magic because there was no way it could have held all of them. A leg came out, a long, knobbly knee with huge polished hoof, then another front leg, then hindquarters, and then the box was empty. Nothing but a metal shell with a couple of fake human legs attached. I stared at the horse who had just sprung from the wheelchair, a huge white stallion. But where its neck should be was the upper body of my Latin teacher, smoothly grafted on the horse's trunk. What a relief, the centaur said. I'd been cooped up in there so long, my feetlocks had fallen asleep. Now, come, Percy Jackson, let's meet the other campers. All right, that's chapter 5. Tomorrow, chapter 6 is I Become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom.